Steve is one of my personal heroes, and a person I've learned from more than I can describe. He's a successful serial entrepreneur, having started 7 companies that made it past the $1 billion market cap, including Epiphany is the most recent one. He's a world-class instructor. His teachings are being adopted by more than 50 universities. And he's hands down the best marketeer in Silicon Valley. Just to raise expectations.
But he couldn't be here today, so they got me.
He's innovative when it comes to company buildings. He can sell you anything, to be honest. He also innovative when it comes to teaching. He's a dedicated teacher teaching at Stanford. Most recent course was called Hacking for Defense, where we did what?
So Hacking for Defense was basically a way to solve problems that are facing our country to keep us safe and secure that our Department of Defense and intelligence community have, who are dealing with threats in the 21st century that they never imagined in the 20th century. And if any of you dealt with the government, you know, they're still using quills somewhere in the organization, and they're used to buying aircraft carriers that take 35 years to acquire and process, et cetera. Yet some of the threats like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others are just occurring overnight. And the organizational structures and the solutions they have and the people they have just aren't used to dealing with what we deal with in Silicon Valley all the time, is 24/7 innovation. And so we took the lean startup methodology, that is, how to operate at speed by understanding problems and then getting out and talking to customers and stakeholders, in this case warfighters, making sure we understand the problem and then build a solution iteratively. And so we went out to the Department of Defense, got some real world toughest problems, and basically put them online for our students and allow students to work on in 10 weeks to see if they understand problems, go out and talk to 100 customers, partners, stakeholders, people with money, contractors, you know, others, and build minimum viable products for different branches of the Department of Defense intelligence community. We started the class last June, ran it as an experiment. It was so successful last month, this January, 8 other universities are now teaching it. We'll have 15 universities online teaching it by the end of this year, and hopefully it'll match what we did for the National Science Foundation and have 50 some odd universities solving real world problems for our Department of Defense and intelligence community, with the unintended consequence of the sponsors, the people who give us the problem, are watching this methodology and now they're raising their hand and saying, can you come in and teach us how to think and operate at this speed with this process? So that's what Hacking for Defense was.
You mentioned lean startup.
Yes.
And you wrote a book on this, The 4 Steps to Epiphany, I guess, which I read. Great book, by the way, highly recommend it. And then you taught a course on Udacity on this.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
So the 4 Steps to the Epiphany kind of kicked off what's called the Lean Startup movement. It articulated one of the 3 pieces of what eventually became Lean, the customer development process of how you actually get outside the building and start talking to people who you think want to buy your product someday or have the problem you want to solve. A mistake we used to make in the 20th century in Silicon Valley and others is just assume I have an idea, and I have an idea, write up a business plan, turn it into slides, try to raise some money, build the product, ship the product, no one buys the product, fire your head of sales, fire your head of the marketing, you know, founder becomes chief technical officer or something, and then, you know, like go out of business. And I said perhaps we ought to, before we like go from vision to PowerPoint slides, we might want to validate some of those hypotheses. And in fact, the key idea was about Lean was understanding that we had built tools for 100 years in business schools about how to execute known processes. That is, business schools created, you know, strategy and operations, et cetera, all assuming that all you had was a process for execution. That's all you needed to do. No one ever noticed that startups actually weren't in execution mode. They were actually searching to validate whether these things were true or not that they believed.
The spaghetti thing that you throw them all, right?
That's right. So to answer your original question is, I created a new class at Stanford called the Lean Launchpad, which was adopted by the U.S. National Science Foundation, and then every federal research agency in the U.S. now mandates this as a class. You have to watch the Udacity videos If you're a scientist who wants to get an SBIR or STTR grant, that is a commercialization grant from the US, you have to go through the Udacity videos to kind of get funded, and you go through the class.
These are great videos. In your book, you have this episode that I remember where someone brought you in after firing the head of marketing with a business product and asked you to sell it. And I think you went to their clients that were almost buying it and said, what if I give it to you for free?
Yeah. So one of the great tests is a pricing test. Is, oh, everybody's excited. Yeah, they'd really love it. Steve, it's on our forecast and whatever. Well, have we closed yet? Well, not really. So you go into a client and go, if I gave you this product for free, would you buy it?
Yeah.
Well, and if you get a well, you realize the salesperson was just like confused. And the other bounding box I sometimes would do is, oh no, we deploy 10,000 of them. Well, I was only kidding, it's $1 million. It's $1 million. We don't pay more than $350,000. And they have literally told you what the upper end of the bounding box was. And by the way, that works like more times than you would believe. The other thing I teach my students is when they're out, oh, everybody loves the thing. They loved our slides or minimum viable product. Did you ask them how much money they have in their wallet? What? Did you ask them for an order? Well, it's not done. Well, they told you they'd love it, and the great way to get somebody out of their office is, this is great. When you have it, come on back. Well, okay. Why don't you just say, empty your wallet, I'll put it in an envelope, I'll seal the envelope, and I won't spend any of the money, but since you love the product, I'll spend it when I deliver the product. 90% of the time, well, I really didn't mean I loved it that much. So in customer development, you find out a lot of stuff about outside the building. But I have to tell you, one of the best things that did happen to me was being a Udacity course, which I think is EP 245 on Udacity.
Correct.
Because it allowed me to reach students and students to understand what was going on in Silicon Valley, thinking about lean startups at a scale and a reach that just wasn't possible.
I have dozens of emails that students wrote me and say, I watched Steve Blank's class, and he just saved me $150,000 of funding. I would have built this stupid thing over here. And then I asked my future customers first, which cost me like a day, and realized this is the wrong solution for them. Who is in a startup or is aspiring to be in a startup company? Good number. Highly recommended. What Steve has done is turn the entire process upside down. What most of us do is we wake up in the morning, we are geniuses, and we're going to invent this amazing thing. And then we start working on it. And as we work on it, we put our sweat and heart into it. And after half a year, we are unable to admit to ourselves it might be completely useless. And then we go out and go to people and take it. In Steve's class, he makes you go to customers and don't even show them what you're doing, but ask them what you want.
And try to understand deeply their problem, because you might be solving your problem, but you might not really understand their problem. And in some cases, they might not even understand what their own problem is. So, Sebastian, you missed one thing that smart people do, is that not only do you have this great idea and start building it, but you put in every possible feature you could imagine people are going to want. And so when you ship it, you're surprised that people only use, feature 12, 19, and 27, and the rest of it is just waste, as Eric Ries called it, waste. The Lean Startup ended up being, as I started earlier, my contribution was customer development. Alexander Osterwalder added something called the business model canvas, and Eric Ries, smartest student I ever had in a classroom, was the one who realized that agile engineering, not waterfall, was the perfect match to the customer development process. And that stack, business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, is what's called the lean startup when applied to startups or now companies or now government agencies trying to move at speed and search for things that might not be obvious what the solution is.
I want to open up for questions from the audience, so please line up behind the 2 microphones over there. And when you speak closely.
This is an ask me anything except for funding.
Yeah. They can ask.
They can ask, but
you don't like it that much.
The answer's no, so it's a...
You don't like it that much.
Right.
I wanted to be the younger Steve, the 18-year-old Steve, just from high school. Okay? You don't have to tell me everything you did. But what advice would you give to yourself? from today's perspective?
Volunteer for everything. So my whole career was turning the common wisdom on its head. One is, as Sebastian mentioned, an adjunct professor at Stanford in the engineering school. I teach at Berkeley in the business school. I'm a senior fellow at Columbia, and never graduated from college.
Really?
And so my education at 18 was, I joined the U.S. Air Force during Vietnam and spent 4 years in Southeast Asia learning at high speed in sheer chaos and terror sometimes. And so, but I did reverse the standard military advice was you never volunteer for anything. And I learned that's just wrong. Yeah, you might end up cleaning latrines, which I did when I volunteered sometimes, but I also ended up learning some spectacular stuff. And the other piece is show up more than anybody else. I would show up more, I'd work harder, and I'd be there when they were, blank, he keeps showing up. Okay, you over here. Half the time there were crummy things to do, but the other half the time, I got opportunities and jobs and careers, and this goes for anybody looking for a career. Show up, be present, work hard, and by the way, the third thing is speak up for yourself. While we love to think the world is a meritocracy, you need to be clear and articulate about what you accomplished, and more importantly, what you want to do. I remember one of my first jobs was a training instructor. I was teaching microprocessor design at a startup called Zilog, and the manager of training and education had just gotten fired. And there were all of us sitting in the training department looking around who's going to manage our group. And finally I realized I could be a good manager, and walked into the VP of sales who ran the department and said, I want to run the training department to teach microprocessor design and the rest. And he said, what took you so long? We expected you in here 2 weeks ago asking for the job. and that was like a key lesson for me as well. You think maybe, no, whatever. Ask for what you want, because the worst thing that could happen is you get a no. So I know you asked one question, but that typical marketeer fills up the whole room.
You start with that.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I founded a startup, and we had I had engineers come on board, and we sold the product, and we had clients, Genentech and VMware, big companies, and we ran it for about 5 years profitably, and we never got venture money, and we were actually pretty proud of that. Just in January, we decided to close it down, because every time we looked at the future and we looked at funding in order to grow it, it seemed like we couldn't make the numbers work. And we still had paying clients when we closed it down. Did we miss something?
Sure. So one is, certainly in Silicon Valley, we tend to think everything has angel or venture capital around it, and there are some classes of businesses, and in fact, you should run the model in hindsight to just kind of, when you get some distance, to think about, could this thing have scaled with risk capital, which is essentially what angel or professional venture capital is. That is, you don't take money because you could get money, you take money because is there value in accelerating hiring or salespeople or equipment or scale? Could this thing have turned out differently at scale? First, post-mortem thing to run. There are other things that just don't necessarily scale. In fact, if you think about it in the U.S., according to the U.S. Department of Labor, 99.7% of all companies in the U.S. are under 500 people. That's what we actually in the U.S. define as small businesses. And small businesses still make up Main Street entrepreneurship, and most of them are not scalable. And you might have actually could run the analysis and say, Steve, it was a small business at its core, and we ran it as a small business. We made some money. We had a great time, but it was not a scalable business. And so the first question you need to ask is, am I building a small business? No shame in that. That's actually what in fact, what I call, that's what normal people do. They either build small businesses or go they work for real companies. It's only crazy people who inhabit Silicon Valley and entrepreneurial clusters who are usually unemployable by anybody else. I think that's right. Both of us are sitting up here. And the good news is that, it's fun. The bad news is it becomes your life rather than a job. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for taking my question, and thank you for being here. I actually use your course in a course that I teach at the junior college. We teach a computer science program, and then into the AA degree, I have a final projects class, and I bring in guest speakers, and I run videos, and then I have them watch your your class and to bring in some insight. Taking the principles that you have developed for leans and cool things like, what do you see the impact of education as a whole? Because there's a lot of things that are coming down the state in curriculum development and accountability and measurements and this measure that, and what is a demographic and all these other things that are getting measured, but they're all on different scales. So we're not going to get anything intelligent. It's just going to be noise.
So I'm going to answer your question in a very funny way, specifically about teaching innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, when I started teaching, my friend John Rubenstein, who used to run hardware engineering at Apple and then Palm, who I knew for decades, looked at me as an educator and laughed hysterically. He said, "Steve, you can't teach entrepreneurship. You were born entrepreneur. You know, like, you can't teach people how to be entrepreneurs." And I thought about that, and I said, well, that's funny. I am teaching entrepreneurship. But it troubled me for decades because people actually asked that question a lot. And it turns out we were asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether you could teach entrepreneurship. The question is, who can you teach it to? This is a big idea. Because the mistake is that thinking that entrepreneurship is the same as being a Java programmer or an accountant or something else. If you want to start something, you're closer to an artist than any other profession. You see things that other people don't. You hear things that other people don't. Artists you see a blank canvas, they see Starry Night. You see a 12-foot block of marble, they already see the Pieta and they just need to remove the stone. So for 500 years, we've understood that artists can actually be trained, but you can't assign somebody the job of sculptor or painter or composer. It's something inside them, but you could teach them. But we also realized 100 years ago that teaching art appreciation to the entire community is actually valuable not only to the artists, because they'll have people to buy their stuff, but more importantly, to society in general. I think there are exact parallels about entrepreneurship education. That is, for people who desperately want to become entrepreneurs, you will fight your way into finding entrepreneurial education opportunities. But for the rest of you, whether you're in a corporation or you're a senior manager or somebody just interested in college and understanding business, in the 21st century, we ought to have the equivalent of entrepreneurship appreciation classes just widely spread out through our culture. So that's my best answer.
You mean the people who admire you?
I'm sorry?
The Steve fan club.
It's less the Steve fan club. It's the Sebastian fan club, or the Elon Musk fan club, or the Steve Jobs fan club. In fact, think about it. We now understand that it's great to expose students to music and painting and whatever when they're in elementary school. And my point is we should expose students in the same way from elementary all the way through K-12, let alone college, about what entrepreneurship is and why it's different. Big idea. Why it's different than ending up teaching students about how to set up a lemonade stand. It used to be the only K through 12 business classes that you would get is, oh, let's teach them how to set up a lemonade stand. That's not entrepreneurship. That's how to set up a lemonade stand. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. So firstly, I'm really glad that I'm here. It's awesome to hear from you guys, and it's really inspirational. What I was wondering is, I imagine, since you've literally written the book on entrepreneurship, you've interacted with so many businesses. What is the craziest problem or challenge that you had to address, and how did you tackle that, working with businesses or with your own business?
What's the craziest problem that I've ever seen? Yeah, actually, the craziest problem was in one of our last classes. Actually, was hacking for defense problem. Any of you heard of the Navy SEALs, the underwater divers? And turned out the medical director of Navy SEALs gave us a problem. And the problem was the SEALs were spending too much time underwater, and they were getting the bends and whatever. And so the medical director for the Navy SEALs said, here's the problem for your class. You need to design some carbon dioxide sensors that the SEALs could wear so they could figure out, they need to stop diving. And that's a pretty definable problem. Students were excited, mechanical engineers and computer people joined the class. They formed a team. They interviewed the medical director. He defined the problem. And of course, the first people they went out and talked to were the Navy SEALs, who said, really? You're going to strap new sensors on us to tell us that we can't dive, huh? Really? They said, well, you know it's 0902. Yes, everybody synchronize your watches. At 0904, those sensors would be at the bottom of the effing ocean. And so the team came back with a real problem, but they were smart enough to ask, here's the big idea. They asked the SEALs, that's interesting. Why are you spending all the time underwater? Well, glad you asked, because no one else has. Our problem is we don't know where we are in 3D space. There is no GPS unless we're near the surface. If you could make us a deployable GPS buoy when we're 100 feet under the water, we'd be spending like a third less time. So they went back to the medical director and said the problem's not a medical problem, the problem's a 3D geolocation problem. And that's what they spent the next 9 weeks working on. Does that answer your question?
Awesome. Yeah, I know that. That's perfect. Thank you.
I suspect we have only time for one more question. And
Who has the best question? Is that the best question?
No, sir, thank you.
No pressure. No pressure. All right.
So you alluded to this in your book and in your talk today as well. Sometimes it's a challenge to elicit what the business really wants or your customer really wants.
Yes.
What have you learned ever since you've written the book that has changed your views, or something new that you have learned that can help a budding entrepreneur get that from their customer?
Well, everything I've written, Eric Ries has written, the Design Thinking School at Stanford, everybody's written a lot about how to kind of understand customer problems. And I guess the biggest thing I could offer is there's a ton of tools to do that. But this is over time what makes entrepreneurial fingertip feel, meaning you get good at it at first over practice. And the other thing I'll suggest for any of you thinking about a startup, your first idea is almost always wrong about what the customer wants. Go ask Sebastian. Oops. But it's less so, am I nailing it, understanding it right, but what you do when you find it out, and that's called the pivot. Eric Ries named it, but I drew it. He named it, and I think the pivot's a key idea about this whole process, is after you get repeatable data. And by the way, when you're getting the data, it doesn't come in the form of a memo that says you're wrong or your assumptions are wrong. It just comes with chaotic, sometimes it says you're right, but sometimes the stuff isn't like, sales aren't working and whatever, usually the first sign. Your job is to make sense out of, you're looking for signals out of noise. And your job is to take that and make a substantive change, and a pivot is iteration without crisis. You know, Udacity is a perfect example of that.
We had a good amount of crisis.
SpaceX pivoted. Tesla did some little pivots, but SpaceX did some massive pivots. And great founders, by the way, always reinvent the past. Oh, we had planned that all along. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Honestly, eBay was exactly going to look like this, and SpaceX was going to look like Udacity. We rewrote history. And I know you haven't. I know you haven't. But my point is, great founders pivot. And then kind of have this past amnesia where they're new marketeers that tend to create a new persona of what happened. But that's what allows 21st century startups to operate with speed and urgency. And so thank you for the question.
Thank you.
It was a good
question. I want to thank Steve. You're one of my heroes, and you can probably understand why I always love to listen to him and learn from him. We have a class online. If you care about it, you can buy his book. And he's very available. He writes a blog. Yep. Which is really, really interesting.
SteveBlank.com.
SteveBlank.com. And for all of you, I think this is Silicon Valley pure. You got half an hour of one of the most amazing men on the planet. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Sebastian. It was great.